Welcome, foolish viewer. Welcome to another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile Halloween Edition 2. If you're new here, welcome to my channel and welcome to the cute live. I'm your cult leader, Leah. If you're not new here, thank you for returning for another cult meeting. On Wednesdays, I try to do a series called Beauty and the Bibliophile, where I do my makeup and I tell you about the latest book that I've read. If you don't know what a bibliophile is, it is a lover and collector of books. Today's book is actually a collection of stories. It is Tales from the Haunted Mansion, Volume 1, The Fearsome Foursome. And this came out in 2016. Now this is a collection of short stories, all based on something to do with the Haunted Mansion. And it could be any one of the Haunted Mansion rides from any of the Disney parks. Now, just so you know, spoiler alerts. I am only going to be talking about one of these stories for the sake of time, but if you're thinking about reading this book and you don't want to know anything about it, don't watch this video. If you want just a little sampling, stay tuned. Okay, so this book opens with a warning. Stop reading. The narrator beseeches you, put the book down. You're not the type. And what type is that, you may ask? Well, our type. Still here? Very well. Don't say I didn't warn you. So the narrator continues. Welcome, foolish reader, to, well, you know where you are. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Amicus Arkin, the sole librarian here and the keeper of 999 tales. Every spirit has a tale, a story, but we're always looking for one more. Maybe yours? Now, if you haven't guessed, Amicus is a ghost. And books, stories, are kind of like ghosts. Their very bindings contain the spirits of the dead. And that means that this very terrifying tale and the book that I was actually holding and the story that you are hearing is actually a ghost. Which brings us to the subject at hand, the Fearsome Foursome. Now, the Fearsome Foursome is a little club made up of 4 middle school students, Willa, Tim, Noah, and Steve. And they love all things horror and ghosts and spooky, mummies, anything that goes bump in the night. And they actually make up their own scary stories. And they have such an appetite for the macabre. But that week, their meeting was abruptly canceled. Earlier in the day, their regular headquarters, a clubhouse in Willa's backyard, I believe, had mysteriously been destroyed in a freakish storm. Came from nowhere. And in its place stood 4 frighteningly fancy invitations, inviting them to a place across town. So they got together after dark, toting their usual scary overnight story telling paraphernalia, blankets, marshmallows, flashlights, and they made their way to an unwelcoming wrought iron gate at a very large estate. Now the gate was open, so they slipped inside and they found themselves at the front door. But what they couldn't know was that the mansion looked differently to each one of them. It looked how they thought it should look, like it was some kind of a phantom manor. Then they came to a portrait chamber of octagonal design, and on each wall panel was a different portrait. And Noah just assumed that these portraits must be of, some of the previous residents. There were also these gargoyle-like figures on the walls, each holding 2 lit candles. Noah was like, I thought no one was supposed to live here. And Steve was like, well, yeah, that's what the invitation said, that it was an empty building. And Noah's like, well, then who lit the candles? And then something really bizarre happened. The portraits began to stretch and change from serene to sinister. Now, the fearsome foursome didn't know if the portraits themselves were stretching, or was the room actually stretching? Then Steve said, hey guys, have you noticed there are no windows and no doors? How are we going to find a way out? And Willa was leaning against a secret passageway door, and right then it glided open. And so Willa said, well, there's always my way. So Willa walked through the wall, and the rest of the boys followed her. And one corridor led to another, and there was a suit of armor standing guard, and there was a endless hallway, it seemed, with a candelabra just floating there. 4 friends found themselves in a room full of the books from floor to ceiling. And Willa, being the reader of them all, immediately goes over and starts looking at all of them. She's like, oh my gosh, you guys, all of these books are ghost stories, every single one of them. Then they heard a voice from the shadows say, our library is well stocked with priceless first editions. The 4 of them turned around and they saw a very thin man materialize from the shadows. And he had a lantern-shaped jaw. When he talked, he looked kind of like a skull, and he was holding a candelabra. He said, welcome, friends. And Will was like, we thought nobody lived here. And he said, you're right, nobody does. He said, excuse me for creeping up on you, old habits die hard. And they're like, who are you? He said, I'm the librarian. Have I interrupted a meeting of some importance? And Willa introduced them. She was like, oh, we're the fearsome foursome, and we tell ghost stories, the scary kind. And the librarian's ears perked up, and he said, oh, really? And he held out his hand, and a book floated from off of the shelf into his hand. And the kids are like, parlor tricks. And the librarian says, well, that sounds just delightful. He's like, may I tell a story? I have the scariest ones of all. Will was like, oh, you do? And the librarian was like, yeah. But Steve was too cool for school. So he said, I'm not buying it. And he's like, what makes your stories so scary? He said, because they're about you. And Steve was like, haha, yeah, right, nice try. And the librarian was like, well, I mean, if you don't think I can scare you, then what do you care if I go ahead and tell a story? He's like, I can begin with you, Master Timothy. And Tim was like, how do you know my name? And the librarian was like, would you like to hear what else I know? And he began leafing through a book. And he begins to tell a tale about Timothy, about something only Timothy knew. In fact, he tells a story about each one of the fearsome foursome, something only they knew. But we don't have time to go into all the stories, so we're just going to go into one, the scariest one. And that was Steve's story. You know, the cool kid. Now, Steven had a reputation to protect. He was known throughout the school as the king of dares. That is, until Roland Price moved to town. This kid was also known as Rolly, and he had no fear. Nothing seemed to scare him, and the kids at recess loved it, especially the cute little petite cheerleader that Steve had his eye on. She had declared him the new king of dares, so Steve had been dethroned. And no matter what Steve threw at Rolly, he mastered it. And that's what pushed Steve to a place he should have never gone. To the ultimate dare. One that would cost him more than his silly little title. But first, he needed to discover Rolly's weakness. Everyone has one. Now for days, Steve racked his brain trying to think of what it could be. But then fate stepped in. One day, Tim came running over to him and he was like, "Did you hear what happened to Rolly today?" He's like, he got trapped in the janitor's closet and he totally freaked out. Apparently, he has extreme claustrophobia. And Steve was like, yes, found it. Found his weak spot. He hated tight spaces. And he had just the challenge. Now the next day, Steve went up to Rolly on the playground in front of everyone. And he was like, so you up for a final round? And Rolly was like, name it. Now Rolly wasn't stupid. He knew that everyone had heard about what happened to him at the janitor's closet. And he knew that whatever Steve was going to throw at him would involve his fear of tight spaces. So he was like, you know, if I'm going to go through with this, I got to make it worth it. So he said, I'll accept whatever your challenge is on one condition. Winner takes all. This is the end of it. He's like, after I win, you have to declare me the winner in front of the whole school, and you have to call me Your Highness forever. And Steve was like, okay. So then Steve declared the dare. He told Rolly, I dare you to spend 1 full hour locked in a coffin. Steve could see the fear in Rolly's reaction, though it was only for the splittest second. He held it together pretty well. And Steve was like, so, do you accept? And Rolly, buckling under peer pressure, everyone was watching and listening, said that he accepted. So Steve told Rolly that Saturday night to go to the Davis family funeral home. His cousin Drew worked there, and he had access to the whole place after hours, including to a coffin with Rolly's name on it. And Rolly said, okay, fine, and they shook on it. So that Saturday night, they met at the Davis family funeral home outside, and they went in the back entrance where Steve's cousin Drew met them. Now inside the funeral home, there were 3 viewing rooms. Steve goes to the 3rd room and he unlocks the door, and there's a sign on the door that says Price Funeral. They go inside and there's rows of folding chairs lined up facing a little stage. And on the stage is a coffin with the lid open. And Steve points at the coffin and he's like, look, just your size. Welcome home. So Rolly gets inside and Steve lowers the lid and he locks it. Now for Rolly, there was only darkness, and his only comfort was his own labored breathing. Now Steve told Rolly that he was gonna go run and get a smoothie, and he'd get one for him too. And by the time he got back, it would be time to open the coffin and it would be all over. And as he walked out of the room, he exchanged an evil look with Drew. Now Drew goes over to the coffin, and Rolly could hear something going on out there. What he didn't know was that Drew was assembling a dolly. And Rolly's like, hello out there, what's going on? But Drew didn't answer. He just whistled while he worked, and he slid the coffin onto the dolly. And Rolly is like, hey, what's going on out there? Where are you taking me? But Drew said nothing. And Rolly's like, hello, hello, someone's alive in here. Now Rolly felt the coffin traveling across gravelly pavement. Then he felt it lifted into a vehicle and followed by a very short drive. And he's thinking, where are they taking me and why? And then he gets the terrible answer. Where do coffins go? He felt the coffin being lowered. This had to be a joke, right? Except the next sound he heard was not funny. It was the sound of a shovel being pitched into dirt. And then the next sound after that was even more terrifying. It was the sound of dirt hitting the top of a coffin. He was being buried alive. Now 40 minutes later, Steve comes back with the smoothies, and the coffin is sitting next to a construction pit. And Drew comes walking over to him, and Steve can't wait to hear everything. How did it go? He said. And Drew was like, it went like a dream, though I think it was probably more like a nightmare for him. And he told Steve all the details, how he had loaded the coffin into the hearse and how he drove it in circles for a little bit and then lowered it into the construction pit, and how he had, put a little bit of dirt on the top. And Steve was just laughing his pants off. He was like, oh my God, what was he saying? Did he scream? Did he beg? And Drew was like, well, now that you mention it, he was very quiet. He actually didn't say anything. And Steve was like, what? You're kidding. He had to have said something. Surely he begged or something. He didn't even beg a little bit. So they go over to the coffin, and Drew says, well, I guess you win some, you lose some. He figured Rolly wins because it was only like 3 seconds till it was going to be an hour. So they open the coffin, but Rolly's not there. And Steve begins to panic. He's thinking, oh, he must be hiding somewhere inside. He starts examining all sides of the coffin, but he's not there. So Steve looks at Drew for like some kind of a explanation, and Drew is like, I did everything like we planned. He's like, I took the coffin from viewing room 2, I loaded it into the hearse. And Steve's like, wait a minute, viewing room 2? Rolly was in viewing room 3. He's like, Drew, you took the wrong coffin. And Drew just stood there in shock. He's like, oh crap. So they go running back into viewing room 3. The coffin is gone. And Steve starts yelling. He's like, where's the coffin, Drew? Where's the coffin? And Drew's like, well, where do you think? He's like, where do coffins go? Steve panics. He starts to really cry. And he's like, oh my God. He's like, which one, Drew? Which one? And Drew's like, I don't know. And Steve's like, oh my God. He's like, we gotta find out. He's like, call your boss. And Drew's like, call my boss? He's like, do you understand how serious this is? I could lose my job. Worse, I could go to jail. And Steve's like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We locked a kid in a coffin. He's like, it doesn't matter. And Drew looks at him and he's like, we? He's like, the way I see it, you locked a kid in a coffin. I just sprinkled some dirt on an empty box. So Drew headed to his hearse. He was done. He's getting out of there. And Steve is chasing after him, and he's like, no. He's like, you have to stay. You have to help me. He was screaming at him. And Drew was like, you did this yourself, kid. He's like, I tried to warn you, the whole family tried to warn you that these dares were going to be the death of you someday. He's like, but you wouldn't listen. And so then he peeled out, drove off. Now just then, Steve got a text message from Rolly, and all it said was, dig me up. And Steve texted back, he's like, what cemetery are you at? And the only thing he replied was, hurry, the worms. Then Steve remembered that you can locate people through their GPS, through their phone signal. So he'd be able to pinpoint Rolly's exact location. So he gets on his phone a few swipes later and he sees that he's at the Eternal Grace Cemetery. So he pedals his bike over there as fast as he can, and the GPS leads him directly to a fresh grave with no headstone, and begins digging with all his might until he hits something, and it was the coffin. So he starts clearing away the dirt, and he uses the shovel to break the lock, and he slips his fingers under the lid. He's getting ready to open it, and he's so freaked out that he is going to find Rolly there, blue from suffocation. But inside the coffin, there was nothing. Then he heard a cell phone ring that wasn't his. It was in the coffin. And he picks it up and he hears, lost again, Steve-o. And it's Roland Price. Steve was furious. Can you imagine what comments he's going to have to hear at school? And he can hear Rolly laughing his guts out. He's like, it was your cousin's idea. It was all his idea. He said you needed to be taught a lesson. Yet Steve was not laughing. In fact, his eyes turned to stone. And he smiled a little too widely, like he was going totally insane. And then he blurts into the phone, double dare. He's like, all I have to do is spend 2 hours in this coffin and I get my title back. Now Rolly could hear the change in his voice and it scared him. And he's like, okay, Steve, enough is enough. Joke's over. He's like, what are you doing? And Steve says, wake me when I get my title back. But Rolly was pleading with him not to do this. And he was still pleading when Steve clicked the phone off. He lowered the lid, and now it was his world that was total darkness. And he's inside, rambling to himself, come Monday, I'll be king again. Now, total exhaustion had started to set in. It had been a very stressful night filled with searching and worrying and digging. So Steve closed his eyes and he took a nap, just like he said he was. And he fell into a deep slumber. And he didn't even hear the caretaker come by with his shivering little bloodhound and use the same exact shovel that Steve had left behind to finish filling in this new grave. He filled the new grave, burying the coffin and burying Steve alive. By the time Rolly convinced the sheriff to excavate the grave, 4 hours had gone by. When they finally opened the coffin, they found Steve a royal blue. His oxygen had expired, and Roland was forced to concede. Steve was now the king of dares for all eternity. Now here is how we find out how all 4 of these stories come together. But I'm not going to spoil that for you. Now just some final words of discomfort before you turn out the lights. You didn't heed the warning. You stayed to the bitter end. Maybe you are our type. As I've said, every spirit has a story. Share yours? I've cleared space on my bookshelf. You are cordially invited to remain here for all eternity. Welcome, foolish viewer. Welcome to the Haunted Mansion. He said, excuse me for creeping up on you will die. And the librarian said, because each of them are about. Rolly felt the coffin traveling around. Now Rolly felt the coffin traveling on gravelly pavement. Now Rolly felt the coffin rolling. Oh my God.